Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Conference for Research in Early Childhood Education 2022, organized by the Department of Early Childhood Education at the Education University of Hong Kong. My name is Sun Jing. I'm the Associate Head of Department for Community Engagement. It is so exciting to virtually meet all of you here today on this event. This annual conference serves an important bridge to link our department with the community. Although we are not able to have in-person communication this year due to the COVID-19 situations, we consider that it is still very important to have a virtual event. So we have received more than 300 registrations today, and so I want to welcome all of you here. This year, the conference topic is coping with childhood trauma and the challenges during COVID-19. We are very honored to have Dr. Ayre from Edith Cowan University in Australia and Professor Saltmarsh from our department to share with us their insights. The conference will be conducted in English. Now, I would like to invite our head of the ECE Department, Professor Kerry Lee, to deliver the welcome speech of today's conference. Professor Lee, please.
Thank you, Sun Jing. Colleagues, fellow teachers, and guests, welcome to the Conference for Research in Early Childhood Education, hosted by the Department of Early Childhood Education. Now, we've been holding this annual conference for a number of years now. Its main aim is to provide an interactive platform for educators, academics, professional workers, and schools to share the knowledge and experiences in teaching and learning. Now, over the past 3 years, the pandemic has brought many changes to our lives and to the lives of young children. Many adults have found the uncertainty and the social isolation that came with lockdown and quarantine really quite difficult to manage. Now, although there is a silver lining to all of that, in that many children enjoy more time with the parents during these periods. In some cases, the quality of the interaction are adversely affected by the stresses experienced by the parents. Now, to raise awareness and concern for the physical and mental well-being of children, the theme of this year's conference is focused on coping with childhood trauma or challenges during COVID-19. Now, like Sanjay was saying before, because we are experiencing an uptick in infection rate in Hong Kong, the conference is conducted online. But I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Ayre and Professor Saltmarsh, who will be sharing their research findings with us. I also want to thank all of you for taking time and joining us online today. I hope you will find the seminar enriching and useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. So we are now moving to the session of keynote speech. Please allow me to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Ayre. Dr. Ayre's speech today is entitled Children Touched by Trauma, Behavior and Learning. Dr. Ayre is a lecturer in early childhood studies in the School of Education at Edith Cowan University, Western Australia. She has a background in early years teaching and behavior support. She has worked extensively with disengaged and disruptive children, their teachers, and the schools. Kay has a passion for helping build the capacity of educators to develop and maintain the positive, inclusive classrooms with a focus on supporting children affected by trauma who demonstrate difficult behaviors. Her research interests are in challenging behaviors of children, positive behavior support, trauma-informed practices, and family engagement. So please join me and welcome Dr. Ayre. Dr. Ayre, please, and you can just share your screen.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really feeling very privileged to be here. So what I'm going to present to you today is a presentation about children touched by trauma, their behaviour and learning. And in the presentation, I draw on, as well as my own research and that of a colleague, with the literature as a whole to bring together and build our basic understanding of children who've been touched by trauma, and in particular, those children dealing with complex trauma. I want to start by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Whadjuk Noongar people of the Noongar Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work and am situated, and sharing this presentation with you today. I pay my respect to the Noongar elders, men, women and children, past, present and future, and embrace their culture, wisdom and knowledge. Lived experience is really important to also acknowledge. So I acknowledge the lived experience of those impacted by traumatic events and the contributions that their families, friends, carers and staff make to their recovery. It's really important when you're listening to the content today that you look after yourself throughout the presentation. You need to monitor your response to the content that's being presented. And if at any time you're feeling overwhelmed or you're finding the content difficult to comprehend and be with, then please, I encourage you to seek support from your practitioner or your support service that's in the context of your community, and look after your mental health and well-being. And how are the children? This is a traditional Maasai greeting that the tribes use when they move into an adjacent tribe's community. The first thing that they ask is, and how are the children? And it highlights to us the importance of holding the child in mind. So how, as early childhood educators and supportive adults of children troubled by trauma, how do we do that? We take a strengths-based approach where the child is held in mind and their abilities and their potential are recognised within a learning space and a caring space that has them as the most important person in that space, in a space where they matter, and most importantly, they know that they matter. So we need to remember, and how are the children? The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented change and uncertainty to the lives of children, families and their communities. And the impact of such an event, while it's different for every person, will and has been and will continue to be a traumatic experience for many. So when we're thinking about trauma and what it is and how we define it, we need to remember that every person and every child's response is different, but we do have definitions, and many of them that all focus on similar concepts and elements. So when we think about trauma, we need to think about an experience that overwhelms, leaves the person altered. It's an experience where our coping mechanisms are undermined and there are feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and fear. Trauma changes everything. The child affected by trauma is often living in a world of struggle. The most referred to and highly regarded definition of trauma is the one you can see there on the screen from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And it talks about trauma resulting from an event or a series of events or sets of circumstances that are experienced by the individual as emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And there's long-lasting adverse effects on the individual's entire well-being and ability to function. What's important about this definition and many of the definitions in the literature is that it focuses on what we call the 3 E's of trauma. So the event, the experience, and the effect. Different children have different responses. And that is something that we really need to hold in mind and remember. While my presentation will talk about generalised symptoms, behaviours, and how we need to respond as supportive educators, we always need to hold in our mind that different children have different responses. So whether a child develops a trauma reaction that's chronic and severe, or whether it might be a moderate, manageable reaction, this is dependent on many factors. And 3 important factors are the nature of the experience, the characteristics of the child, and the way the family, the school, and the community respond. When I use the word school throughout the presentation, I'm talking about that includes early learning centres and children in early learning and care environments prior to the first formal year of schooling. So I'll use the term school broadly to include from birth right through our primary, right through to our secondary school age children, but predominantly school is referring to our early education care context into those first few years of school. So the way the family, the school, and the community respond is really important, together with the nature of the experience and the characteristics of the child. Because what we know is that children within the same family who have experienced the same traumatic event can react very differently. So if we take a family of 3 children, for example, one child may become very focused and quite obsessive about their academic achievement. Another might demonstrate difficult behaviours, disruptive behaviours, and appear disengaged from their learning. And yet another child within the same family might seem totally unaffected. They might be very quiet, and they might be suffering in silence. So you can have 3 very, very different reactions in response to the same traumatic event. I want to just introduce you quickly to the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This was a landmark study done in the 1990s by Dr. Felitti and his colleagues, and it was absolutely groundbreaking in its findings and results in relation to adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma and the ongoing effect that that had on the person's health and well-being through adulthood. So Felitti and his colleagues interviewed over 17,000 participants. It was an American study, and they were asked about 10 types of childhood trauma that was grouped within 3 categories of adverse childhood experiences: neglect, abuse, and household dysfunction. At the time, these categories were the most researched and the most prevalent. These have been added to in more recent research to reflect the social context of the 2000s and beyond. But this is what the groundbreaking research focused on in the 1990s. So the adverse childhood experiences is a term that's given to all of the bad things that could possibly happen to you. So we're talking abuse, neglect, and other traumatic happenings in childhood. Childhood was defined as from birth to 18 years of age. So this study took a whole of life perspective to investigate that connection between adverse childhood experiences and health and well-being in adulthood. While in this original study, each of those 10 childhood traumas there were given equal weighting. More recent research from that time onwards has also pointed out that what is equally as important to the number of the adverse experiences one might be exposed to, the type and the configuration of those experiences is also really important to consider. So what their research found was that there was a direct link between childhood trauma and the onset of chronic disease, as well as elements such as depression, suicide, being violent, and being a victim of violence. So this was really groundbreaking in the 1990s because nobody had definitively made a connection between adult difficulties linked to trauma that happened in childhood. So the more types of trauma experienced by an individual, the increased risk of health and social emotional difficulties later on in their adulthood. 87% of 17,000 plus people scored at least one of those adversities. So 87% of them indicated they had experienced at least one of those 10 childhood traumas that were on the previous screen. What they found too was that this was prevalent across all populations, all socioeconomic spaces, all right across. So it wasn't particular to one stereotypical type of person or group of people. It was across populations. One of the most significant findings or conclusions that they came to was when a person has experienced 6 or more of those adverse childhood experiences, their lifespan is reduced by 20 years on average. So the more childhood experiences that invoke a very traumatic reaction, the reduced physical lifespan of that individual. And that was extremely groundbreaking, and it was to the community at the time. Basically, it was a real shock that there was that much difference in the life expectancy of somebody who had lived with multiple traumas, more than 6 of those adverse experiences. So that just gives us a really good idea of the nature of adverse experiences. And again, and I will probably say it more than once, but it's really important to hold in mind that there is a great deal of hope. There is a great deal of difference that we can make, even though what I'm presenting to you is sad and it's very confronting. We need to know this because the prevalence of childhood trauma is at pandemic levels. And while that is the case, we need to also remember that adversity does not equal destiny. And there are plenty of people who have dealt with, have been exposed to, and are living with trauma that live happy, successful, very well-adjusted lives. So we can think about trauma as occurring on a continuum. And we can think about it from simple trauma to multiple ongoing trauma that includes an interpersonal element. So a single incident trauma could be something such as a bushfire. It might be the death of a loved one. It could be the death of a pet. So we're talking a single incident that may happen. And then as we move along the continua, there might be multiple traumas. So as we have very much experienced in Australia in recent years, people have gone through floods, they've recovered to the best of their ability from that traumatic event, and then they've been subject to another traumatic event such as a bushfire. So we might see multiple traumas occurring. And then at the far end of the continuum is multiple ongoing traumas that have begun in early childhood, are pervasive and chronic, and have an interpersonal nature. So that means that the perpetrators of the traumatic event are people within the child's caregiving system. So significant adults within their close-knit family community setting. Now, when we're thinking about the far end of the continuum, the multiple ongoing traumatic events that have an interpersonal element, that's what we call complex trauma. So child maltreatment is commonly divided into abuse and neglect. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, exposure to family violence and the like. And they represent multiple adverse childhood experiences. So if you remember back to the adverse childhood experiences slide, you'll remember seeing in that slide that some of the 10 traumas that the people were surveyed on were child abuse and neglect. So together that forms what we call child maltreatment. Now, it's important to note that child maltreatment, when we look at child abuse and neglect very rarely occur in isolation from each other. Rather, maltreatment and types of maltreatment almost always occur together in some form or another. So we very rarely have physical abuse without some sort of emotional neglect or medical neglect and vice versa. So they usually, sometimes, not always, but mostly occur together. Now, when we think about a child who is living in a situation where child abuse and neglect is occurring, that world is a very scary place to be in, because the perpetrators of your fear are the people that are supposed to be caring for you and looking out for you, and you love them because they are who they are, but at the same time, you understand that they're the source of your fear and your feelings of being unsafe and insecure. So when we have a child who's living with ongoing abuse and neglect that has occurred from a very young age, and that is all of those or combinations of what you see there on the screen, and being witness to domestic or family violence, or the recipient of that violence, that child is living with what we call complex trauma. So complex trauma is at the far end of our continuum. That trauma happens in a degree which to most people is quite unfathomable, and it's absolutely unacceptable. Our global estimates vary, but consistently it shows, as I said, a concerning and unacceptable prevalence of child maltreatment. I've just put a couple of specific examples there on the screen. What we need to remember is that different countries have different ways of collecting and reporting data. And regardless of what country or from wherever we're doing our research or interpreting those statistics and reporting on those statistics, we always need to exercise caution and pay attention to the context and the systems around the project and all of the details that go with it. In Australia, for example, from the statistics that we can gather, children between the ages of birth to 4 have the highest rates of our substantiated cases of child abuse and neglect. So in early childhood, it's so absolutely critical for all our educators and supportive adults to understand how very, very important their role is, because birth to 4 is one of our most impacted populations. And in Australia, during that year of 2020 to 2021, we had, and it was made very clear that the estimates they felt were conservative and it would be more than this, but the report was 178,800 children who had received protection services due to abuse and neglect. So the statistics are alarming. 25% of children and youth experience one potentially traumatic incident in their lifetime. Now, remembering that that situation for those young people and little people might be down the other end of the continua of trauma, and that single event is very recoverable from when you have supportive adults, the nature of the experience and the way the people are responding, wrapping around you with support and love and care, your response and the ongoing impact is going to be very different to approximately 20% of the children and youth who are experiencing trauma involving maltreatment. So for us as educators and early childhood people, this means on average, about 6 children in every classroom will be troubled by trauma on our continuum from single event traumatic experience and including, as you can see, our children who are dealing with complex trauma every day. So when children are living with complex trauma and ongoing multiple adverse circumstances and events, they're living with what we call traumatic stress or toxic stress. So the literature distinguishes between 3 types of stress, and it reminds us that a normal amount of stress is a natural part of life and is not detrimental. It's part of life and it's what we live with. So you can see there that positive stress is part of everyday life. Those little things, transitioning to a new school, going to a new job, the little stresses in life that we all cope with and probably mostly don't notice. And then we have what's called tolerable stress, which is more intense, a bit longer lasting in its effects. As I mentioned before, a single incident traumatic experience like a natural disaster, it might be an accident, could be the death of a pet. And then we go to toxic stress. And toxic stress is in response to our children who are dealing with complex trauma, that ongoing exposure to abuse and neglect. So the child is living with toxic stress. So they're living with this constant exposure to traumatic events. The impact of that is that we have little people who have brains that are flooded with the trauma, and as a result, the toxic stress that they're living with, we can think of as roadblocks to their development and their ability to cope. So it's important that we understand that children's brains develop from the bottom up. And their brains are like sponges and they absorb a wealth of information, the good and the bad. And that's really important to remember, because children, for example, who are living in a situation where there's domestic violence, the most impacted children are the youngest ones, because they are absorbing the stress of the situation implicitly. So often people think, well, it's a little baby, it's only 6 months old, it doesn't have the language, so this isn't going to bother them. But in fact, it's the opposite. What the neuroscience has found out is that the younger the child, the more the long-lasting negative impacts of toxic stress and being exposed to trauma has, because their brains are so spongy and so pliable and so open to being impacted with good things and bad things, which is why they're so amazing, and they grow and they learn so much in the first 5 years. They learn language, they learn to walk, they learn to talk, they learn to do all those amazing things. But at the same time, when it comes to toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences of a chronic nature, the impact on their development can be significant, because the brain is so very clever at keeping us alive and looking out for threat and survival. So what we find is our little people, because their brains develop from the bottom up, they are mostly stuck in what we call their primitive brain, or the base of their brain, in that very first part of the brain that develops. They get stuck there because their brain is hypervigilant and it's in survival mode, trying to keep them safe from all the threats that are around them. So for the child that's living like that, their little world is one of fear most of the time. And that doesn't leave much room for learning and play when you're living with a little brain that's wired for survival. That's your focus. So understanding that is important, because once we understand that, then we're better able to support the child, help them heal, and bring some happiness to their situation. So exposure to toxic stress alters the brain's pathways and connections. Even after a stressful event has passed, the brain still behaves as if there is threat, and the brain of that child is still very hypervigilant and looking for threat to keep the child safe. So it's as if the stress is continuing, which is why when children are removed from very difficult situations of abuse and neglect, their behaviour, their ability to regulate doesn't change overnight. It takes a very long time and a lot of support to help them move from that survival brain up towards and using the other parts of their brain. So they become self-protective. They spend a lot of time being in a hypervigilant state. And that means that core developmental tasks are negatively impacted. So they struggle to behave, they struggle to regulate their emotions, and they struggle to form relationships. So the effect of trauma on development and learning is quite significant. So for us as early childhood educators, we need to understand that in general, and not all children troubled by trauma do, but in the majority, and particularly those dealing with complex trauma, they struggle to think because they're in survival mode. They struggle to pay attention. They struggle with making friends. They struggle to remember. And probably, I will go out on a limb here and say, most importantly, they find it really hard to develop relationships with adults and their peers. To be able to develop a secure attachment relationship with somebody, you need to have had that relationship modeled to you. And when you're living in an environment where the adults are not caring and supportive, and kind to you, you don't have that relationship model. So when you get to childcare or kindy or a learning environment with other kiddies and other grown-ups, you have no experience of the way these people are relating to each other. So while we are supportive, encouraging, and kind educators, that child is very wary of the adult in front of them because their history tells them that adults are the perpetrators of fear and their feelings of insecurity all the time. So they find it very difficult to trust. They lack autonomy because they haven't got the confidence or the sense of self to know that they're an independent person with abilities and strengths. And because they're trying to catch up and make up for lost time because the toxic stress has hampered their development, their chronological age doesn't match their developmental age. And that's a really important point for us to remember, that while they might be 5 years old on paper, developmentally, they may be more like a 12-month-old or a 2-year-old toddler. So what we see is that these children are busy coping. And the impacts are, as you can see there on the screen, that's their examples. Of course, it's not an exhaustive list. Because they're busy coping, there's not a lot of space or energy to put into learning and playing. And when we think about learning, learning is relationships. Think about your learning at university, your learning that you do at work, wherever you might be learning, out in the environment. Learning is relationships. Everything's a negotiation of being with other people. And if you're a little person who doesn't get that, you don't understand how to be in a relationship or how to do it, then being at kindy all day, in transitions with people all day is an exhausting struggle for many. And they are busy coping. So let's have a look at some of the coping skills that children dealing with complex trauma tend to employ to help themselves learn. So this is just a graphic to help us pull things together. When we think about it, we need to think about the fact that they've got coping strategies that they're trying to use, and mostly they end up being maladaptive because they're trying to deal with a situation that's overwhelming them. But we think about attachment coping, skill deficit coping, and regulation coping. And when we do that, we need to also think about what needs are going unmet for the child. How are they thinking and feeling? So what we find is that these children are caught between trying to get something all the time and also get away from something. And the coping behaviours that they demonstrate to us are their best effort in getting their needs met. What we need to do is try and think of their behaviour as communication. They're communicating to us that they need something from us. And what they're demonstrating, which often in our situation we would deem inappropriate behaviour, is their best effort of saying, hey, I need you to help me out here. I need you to pay attention to me because there is something that you can help me with so I can begin to learn and heal. So what we see is we see children who are living with complex trauma really wanting safe and secure relationships with adults. They are really wanting an attachment relationship with an adult that feels secure and safe. So they're trying to get positive attention from the adults that are looking after them, whether that be at home, in care, or in the classroom. They want to get positive attention and form a trusting relationship with that adult, but at the same time, they don't want to get too close because their trauma history tells them that most adults in their life have been nasty people who have perpetuated fear and hurt. So they're trying to get close to build trusting relationships, but at the same time, they push and reject those adults because they're frightened. They're frightened to get too close for fear of being hurt again. And they, regardless of how young they are, they have a really clear understanding of the toll that that takes on their little self and their well-being. And they know how much it hurts and how much it, you know, it troubles them. So they're in this dynamic of pushing and pulling or trying to get and get away. So their first element of coping is trying to attach. It becomes a very sort of ineffective strategy because they're in this push and pull situation, and while they're trying to get and get away, they end up not achieving a great deal, but it's their best effort. The other one is skill deficit coping. They're coping with a skill deficit here. So because their toxic stress has sabotaged their development and their ability to learn and meet those milestones that we normally see in early childhood, they have real difficulties with memory. They have difficulties organising thought in sequential steps, which is critical, isn't it, to academic achievement. So it's a real problem for them. And a lot of the time they've missed schooling and learning opportunities. So they're trying to get a semblance of autonomy and mastery over something. But at the same time, they're very aware that in many cases, the task in front of them is really difficult and overwhelming for them, and they don't have the skills to perform it. So what they're good at is escaping from a difficult situation. So they will demonstrate antisocial, disruptive behaviour so they can escape from the task that's causing them more stress because they don't have the skill to do it. And at the same time, they feel confident and a sense of mastery because they're good at being disruptive and escaping difficult tasks. But at the same time, when they're escaping, they're not learning and they're not in the position to be giving themselves the opportunity to learn the skills that they need. And that's where we come in. It's really, really important that we identify the skills that they need. And we'll have a look at those a little later on when we're talking about self-regulation. So we've got attachment coping, we've got this skill deficit coping, and we also have regulation coping. So here we see them trying to get away from any kind of feelings because strong feelings are overwhelming, whether they're positive or negative. And I don't know how many of you are working in an early childhood teaching space or context, but one of the things that often educators say is, but I was praising the child, I was giving them lots of compliments, I was being really positive, and they didn't react very well at all. I think my praise escalated their behaviour and they became more disruptive. And that's difficult for a teacher because we're all so, so good at praising and being kind and showering children with praise and telling them what a great job they've done. Well, children that are dealing with trauma find that really difficult to accept. They don't know what to do with positive feelings. They don't know what to do with negative feelings because it comes back to that lack of attachment and security with the adults in their family and their caregiving system. They haven't had an adult who has done what we call co-regulation. They haven't had somebody pick them up when they were a crying baby and soothe them and co-regulate with them to show them that it's okay to have big emotions and this is how we get on top of those. they haven't had that. So their regulation coping is trying to get away from strong feelings because it pushes them into a space of complete dysregulation where they aren't calm and they're not in control of what they're doing. So again, like the other two types of coping, they're stuck in this situation where they're trying to get something, this short-term relief from the pain and the shame they're feeling, but in the long term, it means disengagement from learning, which is a maladaptive strategy. So having that in mind, that these children who are dealing with this toxic stress and trauma have got these maladaptive coping strategies because they're so busy trying to cope with what they're dealing with every day, they get pushed out of what we call the window of tolerance very quickly, and they find it really difficult to bring themselves back into a state of calm. So it's really important that we understand these stages of arousal for children who are dealing with complex trauma. And as was mentioned at the very beginning with COVID-19, we living in lockdowns where you are locked into a physical situation where there is ongoing violence, abuse, and neglect that you're witness to or a recipient of, and there is no way for you to escape from that space, has compounded our children's mental health and coping, and also made that transition back to kindy and being with people very difficult. So our window of tolerance is a term that was coined by Dan Siegel back in 1990, and it's a space where we are calm, a space where, from the child's perspective, they're calm enough to learn. Now, everybody's windows of tolerance are different, and it depends on the situation. And I'm sure you can think of many situations where you had a very narrow window of tolerance, where something might have happened that a very strong feeling pushed you beyond your feelings of calmness. But when we are in a secure, loving space, we can very easily bring ourselves back down because we have the skills and the coping mechanisms to do that effectively. When you don't, you get pushed out of your window of tolerance very quickly. So when children do get pushed out of their window of tolerance, we see their behaviour escalate. Now, the diagram on the screen there is my colleague and mine representation, and you need to understand that it doesn't always happen in that linear fashion, but it's a very good way to visualise it and get our heads around what this means for us and also for the child. So if we start in our window of tolerance where the child's calm enough, and then we see bubbling behaviours that push them into what we call escalation. So when a child's feeling escalated, they're feeling threatened. So what we need to do is we need to look for warning signs so that we can prevent and proactively keep the child close as we can, or even back into their window of tolerance. So we look for changes in their behaviour, things that they might do when they're feeling agitated, because we need to be proactive. And as educators and supportive adults in any environment with a traumatised child, we need to reframe that bubbling disruption as the child needing our extra attention and help. If we're thinking about the child's behaviour from a punitive stance, where the child should know better, it's all their fault, they just need to do as they're told, that's not helpful to anybody, and it's not going to help the child to learn the skills that they need to begin to heal. So we need to be empathetic and we need to be consistent. So the child at the moment is getting a little bit agitated, behaving in a way that we think, this isn't looking great. They seem to be, a bit distracted, and their behaviour is escalating. If that behaviour continues to escalate, it moves into what we call hyper-arousal. And this is the fight type of behaviour. So you would probably have heard of, and if you think back to the slide about the brain, you would have seen that we have children in their survival brain down at the bottom of their brain, and that is our fight, flight, and freeze space. So our children dealing with chronic trauma and complex trauma are in that survival part of their brain. So we see these fight, flight, and freeze behaviours. So when they're really hyper aroused and they've been really pushed out of their window of tolerance, and we see fight behaviours, we see unsafe outburst type of behaviours. Whether we see outburst type of behaviours or inward, very quiet type of behaviours, which we'll look at when we get to dissociation, the child is seeking safety. Regardless of the nature of the behaviour, they're seeking safety because they are so fearful and overwhelmed. So when we see the child in hyperarousal and we see these fight behaviours, and they are outburst type behaviours, this is when we see behaviours that are often unsafe. Lots of physical aggression, perhaps, or verbal aggression. What we need to understand is because they're in their survival part of their brain, they are not capable of rationally thinking. They can't think rationally, they can't plan. So all the amount of educator or adult talk is not going to work. What they say in the literature is their brain is offline. Their smoke alarm has gone off, they're completely overwhelmed, and their trauma history is driving this behaviour. So as the adult, the most important thing is here that we have a plan, whatever that might look like in your context, keep everybody safe, the other children, the child themselves, and the educators, and that we remain rationally detached. Now, rationally detached means that we do not take the behaviour personally, that we know and understand from what we've learned about trauma that the child's behaviour is driven by their trauma history, and they're overwhelmed, and what they know is what they're showing you. They are in survival mode here. Their brain is keeping them safe. The brain has set them into fight mode as a matter of survival. And we see these type of behaviours. So this is what we call hyperarousal. So if we come back to thinking about children who are still seeking safety but are demonstrating different behaviours, and they've been pushed below their window of tolerance, we call that hypoarousal. And hypoarousal is where we see the system, rather than being heightened and outbursts and fight behaviours, we see more flight and retreating behaviours. Sometimes in the literature, this is called where the system begins to go into a state of collapse, where the child starts to shut down. And they're still seeking safety, but they're doing it in a different way, where their survival mode is that they want to disappear, basically. They want attention taken away from them. They want to basically try and become invisible. So we see behaviours that where they want the attention to be taken away from them. So they're feeling flustered and avoidant, but rather than escalating upwards to physical aggression and outbursts and that hyper-arousal, that fight behaviour, they're becoming quieter. They're still rational, they can make decisions, but they're starting to avoid, and they're starting to pretend, you know, they're starting to not listen, and they're not with you as much as they should be, but they're still there, but they might be escaping a lot, going to the toilet when they don't need to, asking for drinks of water, avoiding. So they're quite avoidant because they're becoming flustered and they're trying to escape in a way that is quiet and closing down. So we need to give gentle reminders, and we always need to be kind We need to give take-up time and all of those things there that you can read on the screen. What's most important here is that we remember that they need us to remain calm at all times and put the story back into order for them. So if this behaviour continues, this comes to what we call our most complex and worrying state, which is the state of freeze, which is also known as dissociation. So dissociation is an extreme stage of arousal where fight or flight is not an option. So here we see the child completely overwhelmed, completely shut down, not with it, where they dissociate themselves into little parts where they can separate all of the fear and the hurt that they're experiencing, and they can slot it in their mind at the back and move it away from their awareness so they can continue to function. It's a very extreme stage of arousal, and a child that would demonstrate this stage of arousal would be a child who is dealing with chronic trauma, and they would have a team around them, of course, with psychologists and social workers, family members and other experts to help them, because this is beyond the expertise of the educator alone, as is much of this. We always talk about supporting children with trauma with the fact that there is a team around the child. So the next couple of slides are there for you just to have a look at. I'm not going to go through them all, but that slide there talks about fight, flight, and freeze, the behaviours and what might be happening. When we're looking at children who are very young, there's some examples there for you of fight, flight, and freeze behaviours. So in general, we can describe it as their fight behaviours are part of them coping and frightening off the threat. And their flight behaviours are their best way to put distance between them and the threat that they're feeling. So we might see some of those behaviours. Can I just say at this point too, that you will see those behaviours in children who are not dealing with trauma. You will see separation anxiety for many children who are living in loving, secure families where they're cared for and they have everything that they need. You will see children in those situations who sometimes hit and sometimes bite because that's what they do developmentally. So we need to always remember that these generalised symptoms and behaviours are what we see in most children that are dealing with chronic trauma and complex trauma. And we need to remember too that we're looking at this in the context of those trauma histories. So yes, these behaviours can be one-off, they can be regular behaviours for children who are not traumatised, but these are really important behaviours to understand in terms of the child's coping strategies and also those stages of arousal. Self-regulation for children is tricky, and you have probably by now got a really good idea why that is so. What we need to understand is, like I said before, early childhood learning environments are all about being with other people. So the best support that we can give young children dealing with trauma to help them self-regulate is to model and give them lots of opportunity. And our best way of doing that, keeping in mind the nature of their abilities to cope, is through play-based experiences. I'm not preaching to the converted probably here, I know, but we are seeing in Australia, and this is my opinion, and I can safely say the opinion of the colleagues that I work with at the moment, we are seeing a very gradual erosion of play-based learning activities in our schooling system. And I can't emphasise enough the importance of providing play-based experiences for children who are trying to live with trauma. The research tells us that play has got a significant role in a child dealing with trauma's process of healing. It facilitates brain organisation, it disarms fear, it reduces the levels of toxic stress, and it provides a buffer to adversity. These kiddies don't have the capacity to change their environment. We need to do it for them. They find it really difficult to adapt and change, so we need to change the environment for them to support them. And one of our best strategies is to have play-based learning available to them as much as we possibly can. So care, connection, and consideration. Feeling safe is very different to being safe. When you feel safe, you have the confidence to explore in your learning, you feel confident enough to take risks because you know that the adults around you care about you and they'll be there to support you if you fail. So we need to make connections. We need to make connections with little people so that we can then build trust. We need to connect first and build on that connection to build trust and build those trusting relationships with them. It's really important that they have really clear expectations, routines, and procedures. Mostly their lives outside of the space where you are is chaotic. They really thrive in a space where everything is clear, organised, and predictable. And of course, where they are championed and their strengths and their abilities are the focus. So healing does happen, and a significant factor in their healing is an adult who cares about them. So our children troubled by trauma are much more than the labels, the diagnoses, and the adversity that may befall them. They're a unique individual that needs to be nurtured and grown in an environment where they're seen as a worthwhile and wonderful little person. The consequences of trauma for children from adverse events and situations are multiple, and yet they're not well understood. Children affected by trauma need safety, love, and positive regard from an adult who cares deeply about them. These children are often labelled disruptive and defined, when in truth, they are hurt and misunderstood. They need a space for learning where fear, distress, and sadness is okay. A space of felt safety that tells them that they matter and that they are not alone. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here and thank you for caring.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kia, for your very comprehensive introduction of children's trauma and children's trauma behavior, as well as the coping strategies. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
As some of our audience left the comments in the chat box, the Dr. Ayre's presentation just give us a lot of information, very practical information, and give us a lot of insights. So thank you very much for the very wonderful sharing. So now please allow me to welcome Professor Okerson Saltmarsh to give us the second talk. Her talk is entitled Family Challenges in Challenging Times. Can Schools and the Kindergartens Make a Difference? Sue Saltmarsh is Professor, Department of Early Childhood Education at the Education University of Hong Kong. She's an interdisciplinary researcher with a background in cultural studies and the sociology of education. Her research on parent-school engagement explores how parents experience and navigate the everyday cultural norms and organizational practices of schooling, as well as the perspective of teachers, school leaders, and the teacher educators on working with parents. She has extended this work in recent years to consider how periods of family crisis and experiences of family violence impact on the relationship between home and the school, So now please join me and welcome Professor Saltmarsh. And Professor Saltmarsh, you can just share your screen.
Thank you, Sanjin.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? I've just escaped from hotel quarantine this morning and arrived back in my apartment and have a jackhammer overhead, and I thought nothing screams welcome to Hong Kong like a jackhammer in your apartment tower when you're giving a talk at a conference. So please bear with me if there's any residual noise. Today, I'd really like to talk to you about some work that in a number of ways connects with the work that Kay has presented to us. Dr. Ayre and I have been collaborating on some projects to do with families going through periods of crisis. And so I hope that our talks will have several points of connections for you today. So something that I'm interested in exploring in my own research is what happens for children when things go wrong at home, and whether schools and kindergartens can make a difference, and if so, how. Okay, so I would take as a starting point the question about what education research shows us about parent-school engagement. For a long time, school didn't really engage with parents very much at all. But really since the late 80s and early 1990s, schools started to be aware that the influence of parents and the interaction of parents with schools is really quite an important part of children's schooling experience. So we know from the research that parents are considered the first educators of their children, and also that positive relationships between home and school form really sound foundations for children's educational success. Now, also in the 1990s in particular, and carrying on up to the present day, we know internationally that education policymakers around the world have really come to recognize the importance of parent engagement. But importantly, they've seen it as a bit of a policy driver, as a way to harness parental choice and parental voice in order to drive teacher quality, educational quality, and indicators of excellence. So the thinking being that if parents are not happy with the quality of education that their children are receiving, then they'll put pressure on schools to improve things, or they may exercise their power of choice and move children to different schools that they think will offer a better deal. So education policymakers have extended for quite some time the invitation to parents to get involved and to really be part of what's going on in their children's education. Now, we know also that certainly in recent years, the preparation of teachers and principals has begun to be enshrined in certain kinds of sort of teacher standards, professional standards for teachers and professional standards for principals. Certainly in Australia, that's the case. But in many parts of the world, and even in those parts of the world that have given paid some lip service to the preparation of teachers, we know that the preparation of teachers for dealing and engaging with parents and with families is fairly uneven. And so early childhood as a discipline probably does more of this preparation of teachers, primarily because young children are more vulnerable and require more parental intervention in their day-to-day activities. But once children start moving into that transition into primary school, we find that there may be less engagement. Parents may not be as welcome to be involved in the day-to-day activities of schooling, or the teachers and school staff may have been less well prepared for dealing with this really important aspect of their work. So this is a really important point, because as we'll talk about later on in my talk, when things go wrong, if teachers don't feel confident and prepared, then it's very difficult to come up with strategies for dealing with difficulties and challenges without that preparation. in many parts of the world, something else that the education research has shown us is that the primary responsibility for engaging with the school on behalf of children tends to fall to mothers. Okay, so homeschool relations tend to rely pretty heavily on mothers' involvement, and mothers, including some that we've interviewed, talk about some of the difficulties that they've experienced if they've been, for example, working long hours or working hours that are outside of schooling hours, and so they're unable to contribute to things going on at school, and then they can become seen as a problem parent or as a parent who doesn't really care about their children's education, and this can place children at a real disadvantage. But I want to move on now to talk a little bit more about how the majority of research about parent engagement with schools makes some sort of common assumptions, and one of those is that research assumes a normative, stable, two-parent household, as does the policy discourse about parental engagement in schooling. There's an assumption that both parents are actively involved, pro-education, supportive of their children's educational achievement, and more or less on the same page on what it is that they want for their children. Okay, but what does happen when things go wrong at home, and how does this impact on the relationship between schooling? Well, the first thing we know is that when parents separate, everyday arrangements change in the household. All those little practical matters about getting children to school, about the communication between teachers and the school, and what is expected of children, communication about homework, where homework is done or not done, where school uniforms are taken off and put on and dropped off and washed, and all of those things change dramatically when parents separate and move into separate homes. And some parents, especially if there are highly conflictual relationships or violent relationships, may also use those kinds of changes as a way to manipulate the children. So to be the parent that the children love best, a parent may not require them to do their homework, or they may create situations that mean they're punishing the other parent vicariously by not sharing information that they may have received from the classroom teacher or the school about something. So it becomes very complex, even in that really early stages when parents separate. The family dynamics also change quite considerably, and often that's because separation takes place following periods of quite a lot of household tension and stress, sometimes arguing, and family violence, of course, can really intensify after separation. So it doesn't stop once separation occurs necessarily. And that can also affect children's learning, their behavior, and their peer relations when they're at school. Another thing that happens when when the parental relationships change is that the social relationships for the whole family change. So this may affect long-standing family friendships, where perhaps families with other children in the same age groups as another family may no longer be socializing together or seeing each other as much. Relationships with extended family, grandparents on one side or the other, aunties and uncles and cousins may change or grow stressed. And relationships within the school and community connections can also be affected. So you can kind of see through these points that I'm raising that what looks like a simple separation may have all sorts of layers that affect what's going on for children, both in their home lives and also in their schooling lives. And parents are really central to that. And another point I'd like to make is that social stigma in many parts of the world about family problems can mean that parents and children are reluctant to seek help or to ask for advice or to ask schools to accommodate certain requests. So parents may be really reluctant to let schools know that they're going through a separation or that there has been family violence in the home and that the children need some additional support. And they may be also unaware of supports that are available to them through the school. And conversely, school staff may be unaware of the complexity of these kinds of family circumstances. Even occasionally they may suspect, or they may have some idea that things aren't going very well for a particular child or family. But you know, the social norms that we have around maintaining boundaries between school and home are such that questions may not be asked and information may not be shared, so that on both sides, both family side and school side, there may be a lack of awareness. So what are some of the key challenges that this presents for kindergartens and for schools? Well, one of those is the challenge around ensuring that communication about what's happening at the school and in the classroom is really consistently available to both parents, so that important events and activities and requirements aren't missed. We've interviewed parents who, for example, weren't aware that their children had homework until Friday because homework went home on a night the children were with the other parent. And so when they were with the mother on, I'm thinking of one mother in particular, went to their mother's on Wednesday and didn't remember that they had homework. One of them was only in his kindergarten year. So the children got to school on Friday without their homework done and were in trouble with the teacher and teased by their classmates purely because information had only been sent home in a backpack and only one parent had received it. So a number of the parents that we've talked to and heard from have talked about the importance of schools making sure that all the communication that needs to be available to parents is available to both parents. Some schools maintain a policy for reasons I don't understand, but some schools maintain a policy around only communicating with the parent with whom the children reside. And again, this is really problematic because it prevents parents from being actively engaged and involved in their children's educational needs and their learning needs. Another key challenge for kindergartens and schools is balancing the need to respect family privacy and confidentiality, to respect parental rights and entitlements, and to maintain their confidentiality, and especially around any kind of sensitive issues, with their professional obligations under relevant policy and legislation. I don't know about Hong Kong's legislation, but I know that in some Australian jurisdictions, for example, information communicated to the school principal about a family circumstance such as family violence or family separation is not permitted to be communicated to the classroom teachers. Now, the purpose of that is to make sure that the family's privacy and confidentiality isn't compromised by becoming part of a talking point amongst other school staff or leaking out into the school community. But it can leave teachers in particular at a bit of a disadvantage when they aren't aware of the circumstances and aren't really able to ask. So this is a real challenge for schools, and it's a real challenge for everybody within the school community. Another challenge is ensuring that the policies and procedures necessary are in place. And when I talk about those, I'm thinking very much around things like what are the policies around not only privacy, but also protection orders, if there has been domestic violence and court orders put in place. What are the policies and procedures? What if a parent who has entitlement to come to school is also the subject of a protection order that says they're not entitled to be alone with the child or to have unsupervised access, but that they are permitted to attend school functions. And there are many jurisdictions that have these kinds of contradictory problems in place in protection orders. So within each school, it's really important to understand what their jurisdictional requirements, their policies and legislation require of them, so that school staff can be confident not only that they are compliant with that legislation, but they'll have the support of school leadership if there's any kind of controversy or legal action taken against the school. Another challenge typical for kindergartens and schools is ensuring that staff are really well informed and sensitive to the effects of complex trauma. And I won't talk too much about this because Kay's covered it so beautifully in the previous presentation. But it is really important to bear in mind that this can be a real challenge for schools if their staff haven't been prepared either in their pre-service teacher education for trauma-informed practice, or haven't yet encountered any professional development in that regard. So this is a real challenge for schools because, of course, we don't want responses to trauma-affected children to compound the problems. We want them to be helping, not compounding the problems. And another key challenge for kindergartens and schools that typically comes up is how to manage the conflict that might come up. What happens if two parents make contradictory claims, or if one makes allegations against the other one, or requests various supports, either that seem unusual or that they want to use those supports as a way to gather evidence in the absence of any evidence to support allegations in court. So there's a real potential for staff in kindergartens and schools to be manipulated and coerced by people through what might otherwise be normal processes and service provision that the school might be able to offer. So those are some of the key challenges, and I'll talk a little bit more about this question of coercion as we go on. Okay, so what are some of the critical facts about family violence in particular that schools and school staff may not know about? One of these is that not all forms of family violence involve physical abuse. This is a really common misconception. And in fact, many victims of family and domestic violence don't realize that that they are living in violent situations because they may be subjected to psychological abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, all sorts of different forms of abuse, but they don't realize that it's abuse because they're not being beaten up or hit. So it's important. It's a common myth in most cultures, and important that that our school staff understand that all of these kinds of attempts to isolate people, intimidate them, manipulate and control them are all forms of violence, and that they can actually be more damaging than physical violence. Another critical fact that educators may not be aware of is that family violence doesn't just affect the adults involved. It's also really harmful to children, to such an extent that many experts have shown that for a child to witness family violence is as damaging as experiencing it. And for that reason, there have been many calls that for legislative change around this question, because exposing children to family violence is seen now as a form of child abuse itself. Okay, now the COVID-19 pandemic has really compounded these issues, and we'll talk about those in a coming slide. Another critical fact is that parents involved in court proceedings about custody disputes in particular may be up to 75 times more likely to have been affected by family violence. And you know, when you think about this, I think the range is something around 36 to 75%. It's not particularly surprising that in situations where people can't negotiate because of violence, they would need to resort to a court to resolve any kind of custody disputes and decisions around where the children live and who's going to take primary responsibility for them and so on. But there is a common misconception that that the court will sort it out, and that once families have parents have separated, that the family violence will stop and the court will resolve it. But that leads to our next point, that family violence doesn't necessarily stop after the parents separate. So threats, harassment, stalking, these kinds of behaviors can escalate, or in many cases instead of be directed at the former partner, be directed toward the children. And this again is something that can really affect children's school attendance, can affect their learning and their behavior. It makes them feel unsafe. In fact, it makes them unsafe, which leads to the next point, that the time of greatest risk to women and children is that period of leading up to parental separation and immediately following parental separation. So when school staff are aware that parents are going through a divorce or about to go through a divorce or have separated and parents have moved in to separate accommodation, while it doesn't apply to every family, it's important to bear in mind that if there is family violence in that family circumstance, that's a period of significant risk. And so anytime a parent raises concerns about their own or their child's safety with a member of school staff, especially around those periods, really important to take those concerns seriously and to treat them seriously. We also know that parental abduction is a significant risk factor, in particular in parental homicides and familicides, which is where a parent kills either their children or a former partner, children, and sometimes themselves as well. And this has implications for schooling because schools and kindergartens are often a point of contact. So if there's been abuse in the home or in the family, school may be seen as an easy point of accessing vulnerable children, an easy point of finding out information about them or where they're living, especially if they've moved someplace where they are looking for safety and protection. We had a very horrendous case in Australia a couple of years ago where an abusive father followed his children. He knew what school they attended and he knew what, and so he followed them from the school to a train station, and then from the station was able to follow them to their new home. He hadn't known their address, and both those children were killed. So it's really important for schools to be aware that sometimes these kinds of situations can most definitely have impacts on schooling. So how has COVID-19 complicated these problems? I'll share a few facts and figures with you, but I don't want to dwell on them, but I think it's just important to bear in mind that gender-based and intimate partner violence in general are among the most significant health risks to women and children. They affect around 1 in 4 women around the world and more than 275 million children globally. As Kay pointed out in the previous talk, this means a significant proportion of children. In fact, some experts argue that it's safe to assume that every classroom will have children, at least one child affected by family violence in the classroom, and every school will have children affected by family violence. Now, of these cases during the pandemic, 85% were found to be female, and the vast majority of victims in Hong Kong in particular, 91%, were Chinese. Okay, so this is a problem that affects all cultures everywhere. In many of these cases, people were confined at home together with their children, with their abusers, and the tensions at home had been exacerbated by financial stresses. Sometimes abusers were at short notice no longer employed or no longer able to attend their place of employment. So there were a lot of tensions going on during the pandemic, and these continue, of course. Okay. Another point that's worth bearing in mind is that children living with family violence are at an increased risk of other forms of abuse. Okay, so during the COVID-19 pandemic, children in those circumstances were cut off from their normal routines and from the safety net that kindergarten and school generally provides. And for many of these children, it's also really important to note that kindergarten or school may be the safest place in a child's life. So for school to now be online, managed at home, this can be a really complicating factor for those kids. In Hong Kong, just to give you a sense of the escalating nature of the problem, between January and December 2019, the Social Welfare Department statistics reported 1,006 cases of spouse or cohabitant battering, and that's the terminology that's used in the Hong Kong legal system, all right? But that number had more than doubled by the end of 2020. Okay, so within 1 year. And there had been an overall increase in the following year by March of more than 9%. So we see that that these tensions really have led to escalations in violence. Okay, so and as a final point around how COVID has complicated these problems, we know that around 1.5 billion of the world's children were affected by school closures by the end of April 2020. And we know that information through the World Health Organization. But we also know that children's rights organizations in Asia, in fact, a number of them, there were 6, joined forces and called for greater protection for what they suggested were 850 million children in 18 countries across South and Southeast Asia affected by family violence and other types of abuse. So we can see from this the really rapidly escalating nature of the problem under the pandemic conditions. Okay, now I want to move on to talk more about a couple of case studies that I've been involved in writing up from our research with parents who have separated or experienced family violence. The first of these is Bernadette. And Bernadette is an Australian mum. She has a university degree and 3 daughters. At the time we interviewed Bernadette, her youngest was in kindergarten, her middle child was in primary school, and her eldest was in the beginning of high school. Now, while Bernadette's partner, who was also the father of the children, didn't beat her, he was really coercive and abusive. He was controlling. He humiliated her in front of others. He was cruel to pets. He was very abusive to the children. So when it became intolerable, she left. She enrolled the children in new schools, moved to a new place. The father began stalking her and making threats, and started asking the school to help him prove that Bernadette was an unfit mother. Now, because of the threats that the father had made, Bernadette was able to get a protection order from the court. But despite that, one day, the father turned up at school, abducted the children, and refused to return the oldest one even after police had visited the home. What surprised our research team and certainly was disastrous for Bernadette was that the school, in fact, felt sorry for the dad. He was pretty good at looking sad when he went into the school and said she was being mean to him and she wouldn't let him see the children. And so the school, where Bernadette had had a very good and positive relationship, started to become unhelpful and refused to communicate with her, refused to share any information about the daughter who had been abducted. And it took several months in court before Bernadette was able to have her daughter returned to her and to secure her daughter's safety. So that's Bernadette's story in a nutshell. But now let's talk about Brenda. Brenda is a mum in Hong Kong who also is university educated and has 2 young daughters in primary years of schooling. Now, Brenda's husband was so physically violent that she feared for her life, and in the middle of the night, one night, she took the children and fled to a shelter, fearing that her husband would kill her and the children. Now, this was right during the middle of the pandemic, when classes had been moved online. It was really difficult for the children to attend online classes because the shelter had really strict rules about the use of devices and internet because of the risks of safety to the residents. So if dangerous men are able to find out your location by tracking devices, for example, then nobody in the shelter is safe. So there are very strict rules around this. Now, eventually, Brenda felt that she didn't have any option but to permit her children to move back in with their father, despite his abusive behavior, because otherwise she feared that their education was going to be compromised. Now, in Brenda's case, the father was treated by the school as the responsible parent. And so Brenda remains to this day isolated from her children, and the school communicates really only with the father about the children's education and schooling progress. Okay, so they're really some similar stories. but even though they take place in very different contexts. So they're stories that are unique, but they're experiences about how their former partners used the school to manipulate the children, or to manipulate and abuse the women, and the children shared some common features. And these include the men using schools to try and gain information about the women and children, including in Brenda's case, her whereabouts in terms of what shelter she was in. The men contacting schools to make allegations about women and their parenting, using school services such as counselling and processes to try and manufacture evidence of their claims. This is a pretty common ruse by some of these men, is that they have no evidence that the women are abusive mothers or mentally unfit. So they'll make an appointment to see the school counsellor and even coach the children to make false allegations against the mother so that it gets recorded in the formal documentation that then child protection legislation often obliges schools to release in court cases. Some of these men used travel to and from school, the children's travel to and from school, as a means of tracking the children's locations, demanding access to the children before any court parenting orders had been finalized, and procedural stalking, and what we have termed in our research the coercion of organizational networks in order to manipulate school staff into letting the men, these abusive men, control the narrative around what's happening with the families. Okay, and in both of these cases also, schools had basically been used as a means of either abducting the children in Bernadette's case or withholding the children in Brenda's case from the other parent. So you can see that these may seem like extreme cases, but they're actually not particularly unusual at all in the family violence literature. Okay. Now, even though they're from different cultures, different countries, Bernadette and Brenda also encountered similar experiences with regard to the children's schools. So some of the examples include they encountered a lack of understanding on the part of school staff about the actual risks to the women's and the children's safety. In Bernadette's case, her daughter who had been abducted actually, once even after she was returned, had developed some mental health issues and had been self-harming at school. And even then, the school didn't take the concerns that Bernadette raised with them seriously. Both mothers encountered expectation that were simply unrealistic due to family circumstances. And certainly Brenda's experience of not being able to use internet and devices with her children whilst in the shelter, when the only option for the children to learn was via the internet, was just a classic example of that. They both encountered a lack of sensitivity about emotional and psychological issues. Both were made to feel as though their mothering was suspect. Both were made to feel as though they were just irrational women who were taking out their problems on their former partners. Both encountered not being informed by the schools about actions that had been taken by the other parent. Both encountered the rights and wishes of the other parent, the father, being prioritized over the mother's wishes and rights. Both encountered a lack of information about the kinds of available services and supports that should have been available to them, either through the school, or the school should have been able to direct them to additional supports and services. And neither were provided with any information about that. And both encountered the prioritizing of school administrative and other requirements over actual safety and well-being of them and their children. So that's some of the issues that kind of come up from a parental perspective. But these circumstances also place schools at particular kinds of risk as well. And I really want to emphasize that, because while my research begins with parents, it's not anti-school. We understand that these are complex issues for schools as well. And where family violence is concerned, there can be a number of risks that are posed to schools. Okay, so first, and we've already really talked about this in the previous slides, that that abusers may see school as a way of gaining information about children of the former partners, and then they may use that information to continue their harassment, their intimidation, their stalking, what some researchers in criminology refer to as paper abuse, that is making constant complaints, disagreeing with things that, the school's having something and they need consent of parents, and one parent will, the abusive parent will refuse to give consent, anything to keep this cycle of abuse going and to exercise some kind of power in the situation. So this poses particular kind of problems for schools just in trying to manage the day-to-day processes and services that school provides. There can be inadequate policies and procedures. Sometimes there may be a lack of compliance with legislative requirements at a school, or sometimes, especially as we've discussed, if school staff aren't fully aware of rights and entitlements, for example, or schools' legal obligations, members of school staff may make inadvertent disclosures or do something that contribute unintentionally to harms or something that impacts negatively on the custody outcomes typically, or other kinds of legal outcomes, and that may pose a risk of litigation against the school by one or both parents. Right, so that's a really significant risk and a very important reason why kindergartens and schools need to make sure that they have their clear policies and procedures, and their staff are adequately prepared in understanding those and how they need to be applied. Abusers may also attempt to coerce the organizational network. Now that is, in more specific terms, attempts to gain some kind of preferential treatment by influencing interconnected stakeholders. That may be the women in the office who send the phone call through to the deputy principal or to the principal or to the school counselor. So they may use a number of different members of school staff and stakeholders to create pervasive negative views of their former partners in order to advance their interest and by taking control of the narrative. And schools can be quite susceptible to this if they aren't aware of it. Okay, another way that schools can be placed at risk is that they may be treated by police, social workers, and indeed courts as convenient or neutral places for custody handovers, as drop-off and pick-up points if parents are in a situation of high conflict, or as a place where they can conduct interviews with children, with a parent, or sometimes with school staff about sensitive matters. And that increases the risk of exposure of students and of staff to unpleasant and sometimes violent encounters with a hostile parent. So this is a really significant problem for schools, and it's worth noting that it is highly traumatic for children in the school community to see a peer, a friend, another child in their class removed from a classroom or playground by police or by child protection workers where needed. So the fact that so many other agencies see school as a neutral place where these kinds of things can take place really does pose a significant risk to the school itself. Okay, and school organizational cultures and reputations can also be negatively impacted when those kinds of coercive tactics that we've talked about that rely on gender stereotypes, that rely on patriarchal privilege, that is the privileging of men and men's agendas, and unequal relations of power between men and women, or between institutions such as schools and parents. When those kinds of inequalities are permitted to prevail in the ways that parents are dealt with, or when the learning and support needs of students affected by trauma aren't met, this can really affect not only the school culture, but the reputations. We've interviewed a number of mothers who've talked about the grapevine, the school grapevine. So if the school isn't supporting the parents, or is providing one parent with false information or with misleading information in order to protect the other parent, where it gets around and very quickly affects the reputation of the school. So what accounts for some of the similarities that we've talked about? I won't go through this particular slide in too much detail because I want to move on to talk a little bit more about what schools can do. The first one we've talked about already, that responsibility falls typically to mothers from maintaining communication with school during family crises, okay? So this tends to be expected more of mothers, even though it may not be respected as much when that communication is made by mothers. So this comes back to the second point: gender norms, values, and cultural beliefs of staff themselves can have a really significant impact on the experience that parents have during these really sensitive and difficult times in their families, okay? Especially where gender bias may privilege the views and needs of fathers over those of mothers. Parents and children affected by family violence may themselves have very complex needs that the schools are unaware of, or they may be unsure about or unsympathetic towards, okay? And this can mean that the responses are inadequate, and it may also mean that inadequate attention is paid to risk manager and safety plans. So that in turn compounds the risks to safety and well-being of everybody involved, including the school staff and other children in the school. Okay, we know that not all educators are well informed about signs and effects of complex trauma in children, and I refer you back to Kay's very thorough talk on that topic. And we know that not all schools have clear policies and procedures. We're not all aware of the requirements about custody and access. Staff may still be unclear about their roles and responsibilities. Some teachers that we've interviewed are very conscious of, they don't want to step over what they see as a line between their role as a professional and stepping over that line into knowing about people's personal, private family affairs. Okay, so this makes it really difficult for parents to get the kind of responses that they need in order to get these matters resolved and to maintain positive relationships and outcomes at the school. Okay, so if we want to talk about making a difference and what schools and kindergartens can do, I've put 5 suggestions here that I think are both evidence-based but also in many ways quite pragmatic. First of all, it's really important that there be a whole school commitment to making absolutely sure that policies, procedures, practices are equitable, that they're trauma informed, they're compliant with relevant legislation, and that school personnel prioritize meaningful engagement with all families. So it's about making sure that you have a school culture that values and prizes and safeguards its meaningful relationships with families, whilst also making sure that there's a commitment to making sure that all the procedural and legal matters and policy matters are being, and professional practice matters are consistent with that. A second way schools can make a difference is through professional development, recognizing that many teachers around the world and school leaders and other school personnel may not understand the complexity of some of these issues, the kinds of risks involved, what the school responsibilities are, and how the risk management strategy of the school can be enacted, and what individual safety plans need to look like given any particular set of family circumstances that comes to the school's attention in terms of risks to children's safety. Another important thing that schools can do is they can make absolutely sure that parents have appropriate, consistent access to school information, and that parents understand all of the policies and procedures pertaining to family circumstances, so that if a parent or a child discloses to a member of the school staff that they're having these problems, the staff know what to do, but they also now know how to communicate and what to communicate to parents about that. Okay. A fourth thing that schools can do to make a difference is by informing parents about available supports, taking their concerns seriously, and making sure that they're able to connect parents to other services and agents as necessary. We know that teachers and school principals are not social workers and counselors. In some educational settings, some kindergartens in Hong Kong, for example, do have social workers attached to them. However, we know that in many parts of the world, this is not the case. Certainly in Australia, we know that while schools may have counselors attached to them, and early childhood settings may have counselors attached, those services tend to be irregular or ad hoc, or only available for a morning a week or an afternoon a week in many, many contexts. So it's important that school staff be able to refer parents on if there aren't immediate supports available to them. And again, coming back to risk management, if schools want to make a difference, it's really incumbent upon them to ensure that they have risk management strategies so that they understand how to identify, minimize, and address any potential risks to students, to families, and to school safety that comes about as a result of domestic and family violence. So how else can we address these issues? Well, 3 suggestions. One is by paying greater attention to interdisciplinary research. While in education, we do have a lot of research about child abuse and neglect, a lot of that focuses on recognizing signs of abuse and reporting obligation in different jurisdictions. However, what we learn so much more from fields like criminology, legal studies, family violence studies, from the voice and experience of parents like Bernadette and Brenda, and also the perspectives of teachers and school staff. And this really helps us to understand the complex layers of these issues, rather than just thinking it about as a, here's the issue, how do we recognize when a child is being abused and who do we tell? It's much more complex, and the need for teachers to be better informed, and for the profession, and for indeed academic researchers to be better informed about that can make a real difference. Importantly, we can cultivate climates for professional dialogue. Okay, so creating environments that really encourage members of school staff to be aware of some of these issues, not necessarily just in terms of individual families within the school, but in general, to understand how these issues occur and affect schools in different parts of the world, and to be able to have open and courageous conversations around gender and power, so that staff can be more confident in identifying ways to promote respectful relationships, and also to model respectful relationships amongst the school staff. And cultural change. It's really important that educational leadership, school policies and practices are really geared around this idea of the school's organizational culture. So maintaining a culture within our school that is respectful, that is supportive, that is reflective about our own practices, and able to identify gaps or areas in which improvement is needed, and that our school is trauma aware. So thank you very much for your time. I think we've got now some time for questions, so I'll finish there and finish sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Professor Saltmarsh, for your sharing. And I think your talk really reminds us to reflect the role of our school and the teachers in the early childhood education, especially the post-pandemic period of time. So thank you very much again. Now, let's move to the Q&A session. And we have around 15 minutes for the Q&A session. Actually, when Professor Saltmarsh is doing her talk, we have collected some questions in the chat box. Okay, so I think I may illustrate some of the questions for Dr. Ayre. Okay, so we received some of the questions, and most of them are dealing with the practical strategies and how the teachers can support children, the children with trauma. So for example, some of our audience asked that how can we support teachers in healing their inner child so that they can remain rationally detached, and also one question mentions that usually our teachers do not receive special training regarding this issue. So what can they do? Is there any models they can follow? So can you respond to these questions,
Sure.
Dr. Ayre?
Yep, sure. So when you have any child that's being disruptive and their behaviour is unsafe and dangerous, then it's always expected that there's a team that is dealing with this. I know some teachers feel very overwhelmed and they say, you know, I'm not a psychologist, I don't know what to do. This isn't the only child. There's other children with special needs in addition. And that's very true, but our classroom needs to be looked at as a wealth of individuals, and we need to try to our very best to cater to all those needs. And I know it's difficult and I know it's hard, but it needs to be a collaborative effort. Our best defence as a teacher with very little knowledge of a child with trauma is to build our knowledge and understanding. So the strategies, for example, that I had on the screen during the presentation would work for all children to a certain extent. But what we need to know is we need to understand those aspects about the brain and the gap between developmental age and chronological age, so that when we put in an intervention or we design a strategy, we've got that in mind. Because often what we do is if we do a plan for a child without taking those things into consideration, it's bound to fail, because we need to make sure that what we would consider a normal behaviour plan for a child who is not traumatised will work to an extent, but we need to have that understanding of the adjustments that we need to make for the child who is traumatised, and the fact that talking to them when they are dysregulated isn't going to be effective. You know, punitive strategies such as suspending them into a house of domestic violence is not going to be helpful for them. So that's most importantly is, yes, you can't be everything to all people, but as a teacher, you've got a responsibility to learn as much as you can to support the traumatised child, just as you would for a child with autism or a child who came into your room with a physical disability.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the response. And we have another question related to the play-based approach you mentioned. So can you illustrate a little bit more about this point?
When I'm talking about a play-based approach, that doesn't mean, well, when we go back to the literature, you would know as early childhood educators that there's all different types of play. So what I'm saying is that when a child is dealing with trauma and they have great difficulty holding information in their memory, following expectations and rules and routines, which is what they need, one of the best ways to capitalise on a child who needs curiosity and needs to take risks is not sitting behind a desk. It's being involved in play-based learning. That's intentional. It doesn't mean they can do what they like. It's intentionally planned for the child with, you know, by the teacher with that child and others in mind. So there's intentional teaching. It's focusing on skills and abilities. It also physically gives them a lot more access to sensory supports. It also gives them much more access to those developmental tasks that weren't present because of their complex childhood that they've had.
Yeah, totally agree. So here's actually a comment and says that, well, is it too high, the core is too high for the teachers because the teachers have a lot of things to do in the teaching situation, and if we expect the teachers to deal with children's trauma situation, is it like too high, too much demanding for the teachers?
We're not asking a teacher that's done an education degree to become a psychologist and a psychiatrist. It's our job to understand. It's not our job to diagnose and provide therapeutic care that we're not trained to do. good quality teaching benefits all children. And if you can do that with the knowledge that the child's behaviour may be being driven by trauma, then everybody in the room benefits. So trauma is not an excuse for disruptive behaviour, but it's an explanation, and it drives our interventions. And every child in a social justice situation deserves to have their needs met and not the same education provided as everybody else, because that's not equity. Equity is every child gets what they need. And yes, it is tricky, but what you're doing for the child who is having trouble with trauma is going to benefit all children. It's the same as when we put up a visual timetable for the child who prefers to be a visual learner who may have autism. That benefits all kiddies in the classroom. So implementing a trauma-informed approach benefits everybody. It's not about checklisting who's traumatised and who's not. It's about supporting everybody. But our target, if we know our children well, would be the child who is dealing with trauma.
Thank you, really. And I think our audience also agree with you. And there's a comment that, well, this is a good thought. I think we need to look into both the teaching in the ECE curriculum, but also in the preschool teachers framework of operations to ensure that teachers are well supported to support these students. And I also agree with these points.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. And for Professor Saltmarsh, and I actually have a question for you. As you mentioned that families and parents, they are experiencing a lot of challenges during the challenging time, and it is schools and educators, they are expected to provide more support to the families and parents. But at the same time, the schools and educators, they are also experiencing a lot of challenges during the challenging time. So how can they seek for the support, or where they can seek for support so that they can really make a difference?
That's a very good question, and the answer probably depends on the jurisdiction that they are in. I mean, I think for me, one of the really interesting things, I think the question that was asked of Kay about is it asking too much of teachers to deal with so many children who may have these issues, often gets asked about the question of parents. You know, is it too much to expect that teachers are going to be dealing with parents when they already have so much that they have to deal with on their, you know, in their schedules? And I think a good response to that is really that we should be in partnership with parents. And if we know parents, just like if we know our children, we can, in a classroom situation, then we know what their needs are, and we can recognize those that need some additional supports. If we know our families well, and if we're working in partnership with the families, they will help support the children's learning. It doesn't have to be all up to the teacher, and the teacher will be able to recognize those families that need some additional support, or that may be need to be referred either to speak to the school counselor around issues, or to external services for that matter.
Yeah, really. Thank you very much. And let me see whether we have any other questions. Oh, here's another question for Sue, actually from Derwin. He said in Hong Kong, a lot of grandparents are involved in childcare, seems quite limited support to the society offered to them, especially in terms of protecting children from trauma. So what the schools and the government can do?
That's a really good question, Derwin, and I think it actually raises more questions than I'm able to answer in this short time space. But I think one question that it raises for me is the question of intergenerational trauma. So it's highly likely that children who are experiencing violence in their home are living with parents who have themselves lived with violence in their own homes. So to me, it's a research question that I don't have an answer for, but I think one thing that schools and governments can do is they can ensure that there are adequate supports available, and that we I think this question of culture, and I don't mean just Chinese culture, because this is a cultural issue everywhere, that people are uncomfortable talking about some of these issues, don't like to admit that we have these kinds of problems, or that people, in our school or in our community or in our country have these kinds of problems, and that tends to bury it. But not only does it tend to bury it in terms of discussion, it tends to make it much more difficult to get resources directed to deal with the problems, to provide the kinds of counselling and support services that are necessary to address these issues. So I guess, to me, as a sociologist and cultural studies person, I really think it's absolutely crucial that we ask harder questions of ourselves in organizational cultural terms and broader cultural terms about what we can do together about addressing these problems, and then how can we effectively lobby governments to provide the kinds of resources that are necessary in order to address them. We know that during the pandemic, issues like housing and crisis housing for women and children has become almost impossible for people to get. And that's just one little example that I can think of right off the top of my head, that governments have just not been attending to some of these issues in ways that actually direct adequate amounts of support. We seem to have plenty of funding to build new fighter jets, but not enough to actually provide safety for women and children who are fleeing domestic violence. And so I think these are the kinds of questions that, they do have a political nature as well as a resourcing nature around them, and as well as a human services nature around them. And all of those things are things that we need to cultivate open, courageous dialogues around in order to address.
Yeah, a lot of work, more work really need to do in this area. So thank you very much. We have a little bit overrun. So I must say that, well, we have to end the Q&A session. So if you have any other questions and inquiries, please feel free to let us know. And we will share the recorded the video to all of you after we did some edits. So let me share the screen again. So you will see the scan the QR code here. So we would like to invite all of you to scan the QR code shown on the screen and give us your feedback. It will take you like only several seconds, but it means a lot to us. Will help us to improve our organization in our future events. Please also join our social networks, including LinkedIn, WeChat, Instagram, and Facebook, and stay tuned with us. You can also search EdUHK.ECE to browse our departmental website and know more about us. So thank you very much for your participation in the Conference for Research in Early Childhood Education 2022. We are looking forward to seeing you again in our future events. Thank you and bye-bye.